So I was going to show you guys several Secureboot attacks, some of which I talked about at CanSec West a couple weeks ago. Because I have less time than I had anticipated, I'm going to skip the CanSec West attacks against Secureboot and only talk about some new attacks that previously we have not discussed. So if you're interested in the other attacks and you haven't seen the CanSec West presentation, I'll be happy to make myself available after the presentation outside somewhere, and I can show you those attacks as well. I'm not sure if the CanSec West slides are available yet, so I can just show them to you outside. So anyway, like I said, we'll be talking about some attacks against UEFI Secureboot today. And I developed this work along with some of my colleagues like John Butterworth, who's here today, as well as some other people who are not present today. So to preface this whole conversation, I just want to introduce the idea of the malware food chain, where we have malware that's higher up is fundamentally more powerful than malware that's lower down. So for instance, your operating system level rootkits or malware or whatever are fundamentally less privileged than the code that is higher up. And this is because code that's higher up on this particular diagram executes earlier during your system boot up process. And code that executes earlier is just fundamentally able to subvert code that executes later, right? It can patch the code as it's being loaded or whatever. So it's always beneficial for code for malware to execute earlier during the boot up process, and the BIOS is the first code to execute when you hit the reset button, so it's the most powerful malware that we can have. In this particular diagram, we're not talking about the management engine and things of that nature. So, as I said, it's always advantageous for rootkits to try to claw their way up this food chain, and not too long ago, it was perfectly permissible for a compromised operating system to go all the way up the food chain to make writes to the SPI flash chip containing the BIOS and install a BIOS rootkit, as well as replace the master boot record with a bootkit or something like that. This was all kosher. You could do that. There was nothing stopping you from doing this. So within the past few years, signed BIOS requirement has come into vogue, and this will prevent even compromised ring 0 code from writing directly to the flash chip that contains the BIOS. So it shouldn't be possible for a compromised kernel driver to just make arbitrary writes to the BIOS code. Signed BIOS requirement, unfortunately, doesn't do anything to address the bootkit concern. And actually, bootkits are more popular these days because with later versions of Windows, it's the case that you can't just inject arbitrary code into the kernel because of the signed driver requirement. And so bootkits became a pretty popular way to try to bypass this requirement. You would replace the bootloader. This would allow you to get code execution before NTOS kernel was loaded, and then you could just install hooks into NTOS kernel as it was loading before it ever had a chance to establish the signed driver requirement. So UEFI is now on most of your new systems. Any new system that you'll go out and buy today will probably have UEFI as opposed to conventional BIOS. And as part of the UEFI specification, they introduced this Secureboot feature, which was designed to fill in that bootloader gap. So the way this works is, unlike the signed BIOS requirement, a compromised operating system can replace the bootloader or the master boot record, and the write will stick. But during the boot up process, Secureboot here is going to discover that the replaced malicious bootloader is not can't be cryptographically verified. So it's just going to say, you know, no good, I'm not going to actually execute you. So this is essentially just relegated to a denial of service attack. So the way all of this works is UEFI has these EFI variables, which are also on the SPI flash chip. Some of them are non-authenticated, which means the operating system can change these non-authenticated variables at will. They can contain things like the boot order for the system and the language and so forth and so on. But then you also have these authenticated variables, which are security critical. They contain things like the allowed list of applications to run during the boot up process, as well as the keys used to sign the allowed executables and so on. So what's pretty interesting about this setup is on the same medium, the SPI flash chip that contains your BIOS, your platform firmware, you also have these non-volatile variables, some of which are authenticated, some of which are non-authenticated, so some of which should be changeable and other ones should not be arbitrarily modifiable. So we have to think about how can we have some type of granular security policy that makes it so that the UEFI code is never writable by the operating system, because like I said, you shouldn't be able to arbitrarily modify the platform firmware, but these non-volatile variables can be updated by the operating system. So to do this, we really have to look at the Intel SPI flash protection mechanisms. So on your Intel chipset, it will provide a number of ways for the BIOS and the operating system to work together to protect these differing regions of the SPI flash chip. And yeah, it's really up to the OEMs to use these things in an intelligent way, which they often don't. So chief among these protection mechanisms is the BIOS control register. And if you look at it, it's really quite an interesting protection mechanism. Usually these BIOS registers are quite simple. The BIOS control register is really an exception, though. You can see that there's a BIOS write enable bit, which does pretty much like what it sounds. If it's a 1, you should be able to write to at least certain regions of the BIOS. And then there's this BIOS lock enable bit. So the way this normally works when you have a locking bit is that the BIOS would set the BIOS lock enable bit, and that just means that you can't change the BIOS write enable bit anymore. But that's not how this works. If you read the text, I'm not sure if you can on this, it's just from the Intel chipset documentation, you can see that it's very complicated. It says that if the BIOS lock enable bit is set, if the operating system or Ring 0 code attempts to set the BIOS write enable bit, then an SMI will be generated. So it's permissible for Ring 0 code to set the BIOS write enable bit, but if it's locked, you'll have this weird SMI going on. So to sort of illustrate what's actually happening here, we have some diagrams just to make it more clear. So this is the way it's supposed to work. We have some malicious Ring 0 kernel driver that's trying to make malicious writes to the BIOS or to the flash chip. It sets BIOS write enable to 1. And notice here that BIOS lock enable is also set. So because it's set, as soon as the operating system sets BIOS write enable to 1, an SMI is generated. And this SMI is in theory supposed to come in and set BIOS write enable back to 0. So what's pretty interesting here is that the BIOS write enable bit was set to 1, so BIOS write enable did occur, but then instantaneously system management mode, which is of course this super privileged x86 mode, even more privileged than the hypervisor, came in and said, no, you can't actually do that. Do not pass go, do not collect $200, BIOS write enable is 0. And yeah, the end result is that in the context of the thread that attempted to set BIOS write enable, it never was actually able to execute any cycles with the BIOS unlocked, or write enabled, I should say. So that was the first mechanism. It's obviously quite complicated. That's sort of a really roundabout, crazy way to protect the SPI flash. But there's other protection mechanisms as well. There are these protected range registers, and they're much simpler. They just allow you to mask off certain regions of the SPI flash as not readable or not writable. So the BIOS during every startup will say, this portion of the SPI flash, which corresponds to the UEFI code or something else really important like that, is just not writable, period. Like, no crazy protection mechanism, it's just not writable, period. Nothing can touch this. So those are the main protection mechanisms we have on the recent x86 architecture. They can basically both do the same thing. You can use either one to lock down the SPI flash, but there's sort of differing levels of strength. And that's because with the protected range registers, even system management mode can't write to regions of the SPI flash protected by these protected range registers, but system management mode is responsible for the security of BIOS control, so system management mode can write to regions of the SPI flash only associated with this BIOS control protection that aren't protected with protected range registers. So just to further illustrate this, well, actually I should say the SPI flash protection mechanisms that Intel provides us force the UEFI architecture into the following scenario. SMM has to be responsible for doing the writes of the EFI variables. If this isn't the case, then it would necessarily be the case that just ring 0 code could write to the EFI variables, and that would be an instant security vulnerability because an operating system could change security critical EFI variables to turn off Secureboot or something like that. So the nature of these chipset protection mechanisms forces us into this case where SMM is now the broker that does the writes to the EFI variables on our behalf and also decides whether or not a change of an EFI variable is legitimate or not. So if we have Windows 8 coming along and saying, all right, I want to create a new EFI variable, system management mode is going to say, okay, I'll do this right on your behalf because my var is not an authenticated security critical variable, so that's fine. Go ahead and create this new variable that doesn't do anything in this case. But let's say Windows 8 came along and used this Windows 8 API that they provide and tried to do, let's change this authenticated variable to something. System management mode would go, I don't think so, buddy. You have to have knowledge of a special private key in order to do that, and it would just block this whole operation. So, like I said, the critical observation really this whole talk is that these non-volatile variables, which are security critical in the boot up of the system, are fundamentally less secure than other regions of the SPI flash. The reason is the UEFI code can be made not writable after during the early stages of the boot up of the system, but the variable region of the flash has to remain writable while the operating system is going. That's because these EFI variables have to be able to be updated by someone. So the UEFI code is pretty locked down. It can use these protected range registers, which are pretty solid and pretty simple security mechanism. But the EFI variables are forced to rely on the BIOS control protection. What this essentially means is that the attack surface against Secureboot is a superset of the attacks against system management mode. Any vulnerability that would allow you to get into system management mode would instantly allow you to bypass Secureboot, because then you would have context inside the broker agent responsible for deciding if EFI variable updates are legitimate or not. So any SMM attack is instantly a Secureboot break. So the question really is it actually feasible to get into system management mode? It's a super privileged mode of execution. It's security critical. Intel is aware of this. So it should not be easy for even a ring 0 attacker to get into system management mode. And it's not easy, but it certainly is possible. There have been some attacks by Loic Deflo and Rafal from Invisible Things Labs and so forth. And we have actually found some vulnerabilities as well that we'll be presenting later on this year. So the point is that system management mode is supposed to be bulletproof. It's not trivial to get in, but there definitely are SMM vulnerabilities. Part of the reason why that is the case is because of its security critical nature, system management mode should be treated as a trusted code base. It is absolutely vital to the security of the platform. An attacker present in system management mode can subvert any hypervisor. It can even defeat TXT late launch stuff because of the absence of a SMM transfer monitor. So very important. So with something as security critical system management mode, what we would want to see is the amount of code in SMM going down, or at least flatlining, because less code, less bugs, right? But we actually see the opposite with UEFI. Vendors are dumping just more and more code into system management mode. All kinds of crazy proprietary stuff is ending up in system management mode. Like, you guys probably can't read this text. This is just EFI pwn output. You can see like Dell USB emulation SMM, okay? SMM dispatch, SMM thunk, digital thermal sensor SMM, which is what you would expect to see since SMM is responsible for handling thermal events. But the point is there's all kinds of really crazy code going into system management mode right now. And in my particular case, I had 495 individual EFI modules on my SPI flash, and 144 of them contributed code to SMM. So there's just a ton of code going into SMM, and a vulnerability in any of them would be an instant secure boot bypass. So I expect because of this trend of more code going into SMM, you'll probably see even more vulnerabilities in SMM in the near future, even despite the fact that UEFI is supposed to be quote unquote more secure. Today's result is actually that in a lot of cases we don't even need to get into system management mode to defeat Secureboot. We can actually defeat Secureboot by temporarily suppressing the execution of system management mode. So SMM is a very privileged, important part of the CPU. It's responsible for thermal events. How can we temporarily disable SMM? Well, if we look at the Intel chipset documentation, there's actually a lot of things that jump out. The most obvious is one that just says SMI enable. And it does what you think it would do. When it's set to 0, SMIs will not fire, period. This bit can be locked so that it should not be updatable by the operating system. But we did a survey of 8,000 systems, and we found that on 40% of them, they weren't bothering to lock this bit. And these were pretty recent systems. And this number is actually artificially low. It could be made much higher by downgrading the BIOS. A major problem in BIOS security is the rollback problem. OEMs are generally unwilling to prevent an operating system from rolling back the BIOS version. So let's say you have BIOS revision A3 is not vulnerable to some vulnerability, but A2 is. Usually it's the case that you can just downgrade the BIOS from the operating system to A3 to A2 and then exploit the vulnerability. We've pointed this out, and OEMs are hesitant to stop this kind of rollback, even with the security implications involved, because customers would get mad that this BIOS revision broke something and I want to be able to roll it back. So they're just unwilling to do that. So this number could be made much higher by rolling back the BIOS revision, which we didn't bother to do in this quick survey. So what this means is that on these 40% of the systems, we could temporarily just disable system management mode by setting this, this bit, the SMI enable bit to 0. And what happens then is that the SMI routine that's responsible for setting BIOS write enable back to 0 simply won't run. So a compromised ring 0 driver or root in Linux can just come along and say BIOS write enable equals 1. The bit will stick, and system management mode will just continue to sit there silently because it has been disabled. And what this allows us to do is, because those non-volatile variable regions was dependent on that SMI routine for security, a compromised operating system or ring 0 can just now make direct SPI write cycles to this variable region and change all of the authenticated variables. And as I previously stated, these authenticated variables are critical to the security of the system because they have like the whitelist of allowed secure boot applications. So an attacker can just come in and insert a new malicious bootloader into the application whitelist, so then it will execute despite the presence of a secure boot. So we have a little video of this attack, actually. It's going to be a little bit hard for you guys in the back to read the text. I apologize for that. I'm sure we'll be making this video public in the near future. So this attack we're actually doing from Linux, just to illustrate that this isn't a Linux or Windows-specific problem. Even though Secure Boot is often associated with Windows 8, it's actually part of the UEFI specification, and it's exploitable from Linux or Windows. And in fact, this particular vulnerability is actually easier to exploit from Linux, because in Linux you have I/O privileges from the root account, whereas in recent versions of Windows you have to have a kernel driver to be able to manipulate these chipset registers. So this is an Intel-based motherboard. We have Secure Boot enabled, and we've installed this just fake bootkit onto the EFI partition, shimx64.efi. In this case, it just prints some sweet ASCII art and then loads the original Linux loader. So in this case, Secure Boot's enabled. We haven't done any attacks, so attempting to run any non-authorized EFI executables is just going to fail. Bootkit would not work at this point. And I'm just going into the BIOS configuration settings now and showing you that the way this all looks in the BIOS. So yeah, Secure Boot is enabled. then the DB is actually what we're going to attack here in a second. And this is just a whitelist of hashes of EFI executables, where if you find one of these, just automatically allow it to run. Don't even bother with some signature verification process. And so we're going to use this SMI suppression attack to insert the bootkit into the authenticated DB variable. So we have to go back into Linux to actually launch this attack from the root account. So I'll just run the original Linux bootloader. Yeah, sorry, the text is pretty small. I didn't anticipate that. So the way this attack works is we're using flash ROM to first read a dump of the BIOS. And we created this little application, a PinDB, that will take the BIOS image that was just dumped with flash ROM and then locate where the DB is stored in the BIOS dump and then insert the, an arbitrary entry into the DB. The whitelist, I should say. This is just changing the BIOS dump on disk. We haven't actually attempted to write it back to the SPI flash yet. So we just manually patched it so that the BIOS image, the variable region of the BIOS, contains that hacked-in whitelist for our bootkit. And now we're going to try to write it back. And it's maybe a little hard for you guys to read, but you can see that flash ROM is actually failing. In one of these lines, you see setting OXDC, which is the BIOS control register, from OXA to OXB. So this is trying to say, I'm trying to set the BIOS write enable bit, but when I read it back, it's not set. The value is still OXA, so that least significant bit is not sticking. And that's because currently that SMI routine that's responsible for protecting that particular region of the flash chip is firing, and it's saying, no, 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 you can't write enable the BIOS. I don't approve of this. Too bad. So what we'll do now is we'll temporarily suppress SMM using the method I just talked about and try again. We call it Charizard for some juvenile reasons that aren't worth going into, so that's why you're seeing that name. Okay, so right now we've used the attack to set SMI enable to 0, so no SMMs are firing. And we want to do this pretty quickly because SMM is actually really important. As I said, it's responsible for thermal events, so you definitely don't want to just turn off SMM and then go to town. Some really bad things might happen to your system. But okay, we've temporarily disabled SMM. Let's try to write back the patched BIOS image with flash ROM. And this time you can see no errors. It's succeeded. The write enable stuck and everything, so we're able to append a hacked entry into the whitelist Secureboot list. And then we'll just reboot the system and verify that the bootkit actually works now. In this demo, we're manually launching the bootkit by going into the EFI shell and typing the name of our bootloader. Obviously, if you were really exploiting this, you would replace the original legitimate Linux bootloader, so all of it would happen seamlessly upon rebooting the system. We're just being verbose for clarity. And just for extra verbosity, we're going right now into the BIOS settings, and you can sort of see that we've modified some of these DB entries arbitrarily, which you should definitely not be able to do since these are, like I said, critical to the security of the boot up of the system. Okay, so now we'll just go back into the EFI shell and try our bootkit again. Okay, then we get the sweet ASCII art this time. Any guesses about what that is? There it is. Yeah, probably took us longer to do the ASCII art than it did the actual attack. We had our junior guy do that. It's been like 2 days doing that. So yeah, SMI suppression can be used to defeat Secureboot on a lot of systems and arbitrarily modify these important EFI variables. That was just one way to temporarily suppress SMM. This is very chipset dependent. There's other ways definitely to temporarily suppress SMM. So I encourage you to just go look at your specific chipset documentation and like rep around for SMM or SMI, and I can pretty much guarantee you'll find other ways to suppress SMM. There is a relatively new spy flash protection mechanism that should defeat this type of SMM suppression attack. It's called the BIOS write protect bit, and this effectively just says that only SMM can write to the spy flash. So if this is set, even if you can suppress SMM, you won't be able to write to the flash chip because only SMM can write to it when this is set. Lucky for us, we surveyed 8,000 systems, and only 6 were actually setting this. So this is a relatively new bit, and no one is using it for the most part. In general, there's a pretty long tail with these OEMs for how long it takes them to actually start using new Intel chipset protection mechanisms. And yeah, no one's jumped on board the BIOS write protect bit train yet. So the main point here is that all of these security critical parts of your system's boot up exist on the same medium, the spy flash. The different writability properties that the different regions needs necessitates that the EFI variables that control the configuration of Secureboot are less protected than other regions of the spy flash, like where the UEFI code exists. So it's pretty weak, and there's a very large attack surface against the code that protects these EFI variables, and any sort of vulnerability in system management mode could instantly just turn into a Secureboot bypass. So even though Secureboot is, in my opinion, a good security feature and something that is definitely needed to plug this bootkit hole, it is certainly not bulletproof, and there is a huge attack surface there, and I think you'll be seeing a lot of other attacks against it. And obviously, OEMs could really do themselves a favor by going in and actually using these latest chipset protection mechanisms like SMM BIOS write protect. So just some related work that's worth pointing out. The first Secureboot attack that I'm aware of was a tail of one software bypass of Windows 8 Secureboot. This was done by the Intel PCERT team, and their point was that basically if the spy flash is completely unprotected, so if Ring 0 code can go and arbitrarily modify any regions of the spy flash, which is actually true even on some of the latest, greatest systems from certain vendors, then obviously you can defeat Secureboot because you can just overwrite the BIOS code and make Secureboot do crazy things. Like I said, I recently gave a presentation at CanSec West about another Secureboot attack, and that was essentially pointing out that a lot of OEMs are implementing security critical EFI variables as non-authenticated, so that Ring 0 operating system code can come in and change EFI variables at will without any sort of attack, and a lot of these are security critical that can effectively disable Secureboot. And then also we've come up with some attacks against the signed BIOS enforcement, and if you can reflash the BIOS, then yes, obviously you can defeat Secureboot. Another sort of funny thing worth pointing out is that in our survey we looked at some other data points. So as I already previously said, most people aren't using SMM BIOS write protect, and we also found that many OEMs aren't even bothering to set these protected range registers, the simple do not write this region of the spy flash. So on these 7,300 systems, the 50% of those that were vulnerable to SMI suppression immediately turns into a arbitrary reflash of the BIOS on those systems. So yeah, OEMs could be doing a lot better with using these security protection mechanisms. OEM compliance is definitely a huge issue. As I already said, a lot of OEMs out there like ASUS, I believe, are not even locking down their flash chip at all. You can just like totally destroy the BIOS from Ring 0 code, like totally break the system. And yeah, just a couple people that helped us with this research. The Intel PCERT team, they actually we found some of the same vulnerabilities with Secureboot. That's why we were co-presenting at CanSec West. Rafal from Bromium and Alfredo Ortega helped us proofread our paper. And then Rick Martinez is our security contact at Dell. He's like the chief BIOS engineer. So if you have any security problems, you can go to him. And then the EFI Pwn developers as well. I'm not sure if any of them are here, but we use their code a lot to pull apart the UEFI BIOS. So how much time do I have left? I'm curious. Can I get a number in the back? 3 minutes? Is that 2 minutes? Okay, well, no time basically then. So any questions?
I may have missed this, but how did you perform the system survey?
Okay, so we have an agent called Copernicus that's freely available from the MITRE website. And what it does is it goes and reads a bunch of your spy flash protection mechanisms, as well as gives you a dump of your BIOS in case you're interested in the security of your BIOS, and also if you just want to read an image of the BIOS. And this runs on Windows. The reason we created this was there's Flash ROM for Linux, but there was really no good analog for Windows. And it's just a simple Windows kernel driver that goes and reads all these chipset registers and also creates a dump of your BIOS. And that's freely available if you just Google Copernicus, MITRE, Copernicus like the dude. It'll go to the website and you can check it out.